Imagine someone who moves through the shadows, appearing ordinary but hiding secrets so dark that no one could ever suspect. Person who, day by day, harbors an insatiable desire for something we all fear. Today, you'll be taken into that darkness, where appearances deceive, and terror is very real. If you have the courage, join us on this unsettling journey, but be warned. What you discover here may haunt you forever. In the beginning, he seemed like anyone else. A quiet young man with no great ambitions, just another face in the crowd. No one could have imagined the monster lurking behind those empty eyes. Growing up in a broken home, he learned early on to mask his emotions, conceal his darkest desires. Life shaped him in ways that few could ever comprehend. While other boys dreamed of being heroes, he nurtured fantasies he could never share. With each passing day, his thirst for control over life and death grew quietly, like a seed planted deep within his soul. Later, he described his childhood as unhappy. He first attempted suicide at the age of 9 by ingesting chemicals in a store, a foreshadowing of the many attempts that would follow throughout his life. Later, as a nurse, he admitted to fantasizing about stealing drugs from the hospital where he worked to end his own life. He was drawn to nursing by the promise of being so close to the line between life and death. For him, it was more than a career. It was an obsession, a way to explore his darker side without raising suspicion. And so, the monster slowly, stealthily took shape, while the world around him remained unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. And it was in this silence, this apparent conformity to ordinary life, that the true terror began to emerge. The start of a journey that no one would ever forget. The first deaths were easy to hide. They were frail patients, already near the end. Who would suspect one more injection or a medication given at the wrong time? But for him, each accident was another step towards satisfying a sickening desire. Adrenaline coursed through his veins as he watched the heart monitors lose rhythm, and then stop completely. Within the cold walls of the hospital, he moved with the precision of a predator. Syringes were his weapons, and medications his poison. He carefully chose his victims, preferring those whose deaths would raise the least questions. With each new victim, he grew bolder, testing the limits of luck and the blind trust his colleagues had in him. Suspicions began to arise, but subtly, like whispers in the hallway. A nurse would comment on the rising number of deaths during his shifts. Another would note something off about him. But who would dare question a dedicated nurse who seemed to care so much about his patients? The truth was, he manipulated everyone around him, maintaining an impeccable facade while the body count quietly climbed. And so the shadows began to stir, but not yet strong enough to reveal the horror that was unfolding. Claimed his first victim by administering a lethal overdose of intravenous medication to a patient who had been admitted for a photoallergic reaction to a blood circulation medication. He admitted to killing several other patients at the same hospital, including an AIDS patient who died after receiving an overdose of insulin. He left the hospital when authorities began investigating who had contaminated saline bags. An internal investigation determined that he was likely responsible for this act, which resulted in the deaths of dozens of patients in the hospital. A month after leaving that hospital, he got a job in New Jersey, where he killed 3 elderly women with overdoses of digoxin, a heart medication. His last victim reported that a sneaky nurse had injected the drug while she slept, but her family and the hospital staff dismissed her comments as unfounded. Following year, he moved to Phillipsburg and claimed he wanted to leave nursing, but court-ordered child support payments forced him to continue working. He broke into a coworker's house while she and her son slept, but left without waking them. He then began stalking the woman, who filed a police report. He later pleaded guilty to trespassing and received a 1-year probation sentence. Days later, he attempted suicide again, staying away from work for 2 months due to depression, which he treated at 2 psychiatric institutions. He tried to kill himself twice more before leaving his job at that hospital. He began a 3-year stint in the intensive care unit for cardiac patients. He later claimed that he didn't harm anyone during the first 2 years. Hospital records had been destroyed by the time he was arrested. He admitted, however, killing 5 people by again administering an overdose of digoxin. He then found work at a new hospital, but was soon fired for poor performance. He was unemployed for 6 months, stopped making child support payments, and once again sought treatment for depression in the emergency room. He was admitted to a psychiatric clinic but left shortly after and was hired by a hospital in Pennsylvania where he was placed in a unit for ventilator-dependent patients. At this center, he was accused of drugging patients and was eventually fired after being seen entering a patient's room with syringes in hand. The patient ended up with a broken arm but apparently did not receive the injection. He caused the death of a patient at that hospital, death that was attributed to another nurse. He was then hired by another hospital where he killed a patient with digoxin. A coroner's blood test revealed lethal amounts of digoxin in the victim's blood, but an internal hospital investigation was inconclusive and did not definitively implicate the nurse. He later worked in Somerville, where he killed 13 people in 13 months using the same medications before being fired after investigations began. When a former nurse colleague convinced him to confess to the crimes, the hospital corridors had always been a place of life and death, but for him, they were a field of macabre experiment. With each shift, he grew more confident, more daring, and the deaths began to seem less like coincidences and more like a dark pattern. The death reports were filled with explanations that seemed plausible, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. Some observant doctors began to notice that the number of deaths during his shifts was abnormally high. The causes were often inexplicable. Sudden cardiac arrests, unexpected adverse reactions to medications, patients who seemed stable and suddenly succumbed. He was careful. He knew exactly how to manipulate the records, altering small details here and there, playing with the bureaucracy that often lets the details slip through the crack. It was then that the rumors turned into stronger whispers. "What's going on?" they asked. The body count grew. But the real horror was in the discoveries of the few who dared to investigate further. As they cross-referenced the data, they realized that many of these fatalities had something in common. Him. The nickname began to circulate among those who suspected. Angel of Death. And even though no one had concrete evidence, fear began to set in. Something dark was happening. Something that defied logic and delved into the darkest recesses of the human mind. He knew that the key to continuing his macabre journey was discretion. No grand or impulsive acts. Every move was calculated, every step carefully planned. While his colleagues worried about diagnoses and treatments, he was 2 steps ahead, beating the perfect illusion. His patients were carefully selected, frailest, the most forgotten, those whose deaths would go unnoticed in the grand scheme of things. The skill with which he manipulated the system was terrifying. Documents were filled out with surgical precision, data adjusted so that the deaths appeared natural. He altered records, added false notes to medical charts, all to create a smokescreen that concealed his true nature. To the world, he was just another dedicated nurse, burdened by the weight of seeing so many lives slip away. But behind that calm, professional demeanor was a maestro of shadows. He played with the emotions of others, knew exactly how to act, what to say, and maintain unwavering trust. When suspicion began to arise, he played the victim, lamenting the losses, expressing his own anguish at not being able to save more lives. The most terrifying part was how he managed to remain untouched, even as suspicions grew. He had woven a web of lies so intricate that even those who began to suspect couldn't find a flaw. Clues, the small details that could unmask him, were buried under layers of bureaucracy and misinformation. And so, he continued his symphony of death, invisible, untouchable, hidden in plain sight. As the numbers continued to grow, hospitals began to transform into labyrinths of terror. The deaths, once whispered as unfortunate coincidences, began to weigh on everyone's shoulders. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, but no one could put their finger on what it was. Corridors, once filled with life, were now shrouded in an eerie silence. Nurses and doctors avoided each other's eyes, fearing that even a word exchanged might reveal something they didn't want to admit. But the suspicions couldn't be ignored forever. The hospitals, once places of healing, were now scenes of growing fear, and those few who dared to investigate knew they were treading on dangerous ground. Every file, Every death report, every small discrepancy was like a piece of a macabre puzzle. But the more they tried to assemble the complete picture, the more the pieces seemed not to fit. The real horror was in the realization that someone within the hospital itself could be responsible. And that someone was very good at what they did. Very good. Investigators began to realize they were dealing with something much bigger than they had imagined. Pattern was there, but it was so well camouflaged, so intricately hidden, that any attempt to expose it seemed doomed to failure. And the closer they got to the truth, the more they felt the weight of what was at stake. This was not a simple case of negligence or medical error. It was something much darker, something that inhabited the depths of the human mind. He claimed he administered overdoses to patients to spare them from being coded, going into cardiac or respiratory arrest and being listed as Code Blue, so the patients wouldn't suffer anymore or have their treatment prolonged. However, many of the victims were not terminal and could have been discharged from the hospital before their death. According to later investigations, his primary motivation was linked to his mind. When his life became stressful, killing was his way out. When suspicions finally began to solidify, the hospitals he passed through became a true battlefield of psychological warfare. Fear hung in the air, dense and palpable, but he, the master manipulator, was always one step ahead. While investigators tried to piece things together, he played a dangerous game, a cat-and-mouse game where the stakes couldn't be higher. The detectives involved in the investigations felt a mix of frustration and terror. Every time they thought they were close to unmasking him, he seemed to slip through their fingers like a shadow. He knew exactly how to divert attention, how to create distractions that led them down dead-end paths. While they ran in circles, he continued his macabre work, leaving no trace that incriminate him. Tension among the doctors and hospital staff increased daily. No one trusted anyone. Who could be next? Unspoken questions echoed through the corridors. But for him, this was part of the game, part of the sick pleasure he took in always being one step ahead, always a little smarter, more careful, more lethal. While investigators struggled to find concrete proof, he watched, calmly, almost amused by their despair. And with each passing day, he felt that he was becoming untouchable, that no one would ever link him directly to the horrors he was committing. And perhaps, he thought, that was what made it all so exciting. The fact that he could keep playing this game indefinitely, without ever getting caught. When the walls finally began to close in around him, the moment of confrontation was inevitable. Pressured by the evidence slowly piling up, he was cornered in a cold interrogation room. But what happened inside was more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. With a look that mixed indifference with a chilling calm, he was convinced by his fellow nurse to confess to authorities that he had killed around 40 patients during his 16-year nursing career, with the motivation to avoid greater suffering for the patient. But in subsequent interviews with police, psychiatrists, and journalists, it became clear that he had killed many more, even though he couldn't specifically remember their names, although he often remembered details of the crimes and characteristics of the victim. Experts estimate that he may be responsible for more than 300 deaths, making him the most prolific serial killer in American history. His words came out of his mouth like poison, revealing the horror that inhabited his mind. There was no remorse, no regret, just the meticulous, detailed description of each life he had taken. And as he spoke, something even more terrifying emerged. He wasn't just confessing, he was savoring every memory, every detail of the deaths he had orchestrated. The revelations were like knives stabbing into the hearts of the investigators. Each confession was more cruel than the last, a web of death and manipulation that went beyond what anyone could imagine. He recounted how he chose his victims, how he watched as life slowly drained from their bodies, how it gave him a sense of absolute power. And then, as if that wasn't enough, he revealed that all of this was just the tip of the iceberg. And at the end, when the horror of his confessions hung in the air like a suffocating mist, he just smiled. A smile that revealed the true nature of a monster. A smile that froze the blood of everyone there. With the revelation of his crimes, the world finally knew the extent of the darkness he carried within him. But even after he was unmasked, one last question remained. How many lives had he really taken? As he awaited trial, investigators across the country began reopening old cases, deaths that once seemed natural but now carried the dark echo of his presence. Hospitals in several states discovered a trail of death where he had worked. Old records were reviewed, death reports were analyzed with a closer eye, and the pattern began to emerge with terrifying clarity. More and more victims were added to his list, and it soon became clear that the number was much higher than anyone had imagined. But the real horror was not just in the number of victims, but in the calm he maintained in every testimony, in every court appearance. He seemed to feed off the attention as if the exposure of his atrocities was a prize, a validation of his power. And the public, horrified, watched as he, without a shred of remorse, continued to recount his deeds with an indifference that only deepened the abyss of terror he had created. In the end, he was convicted, but the sense of justice never truly came. Because for every family that received the news that their loved one had been one of the victims, there was the inescapable reality that he had gone unpunished for so long. And worse still, the lingering fear that, despite being behind bars, he was still somehow victorious, having left a legacy of pain and death, could never be erased. He was sentenced to 11 life sentences, avoiding the death penalty by cooperating with the police, and is currently serving his time at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. And so the story of one of the most prolific killers in modern history came to its macabre conclusion, leaving a deep scar on society, a grim reminder that true evil can hide in the most unexpected people, in the most ordinary situations, just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Experts have stated that the reason he was able to move from place to place undetected was due to the lack of requirements to detect suspicious behavior by healthcare professionals and inadequate legal protection for employers. Many states do not give investigators the legal authority to discover where a worker had previously been employed. Employers feared investigating incidents or giving a bad job reference, for fear that such actions could trigger a lawsuit. According to detectives, several hospitals suspected that he was harming or killing patients, failed to take appropriate legal action. Several hospitals had individual workers secretly contact nearby hospitals to warn them not to hire him. Alerted by the case, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and 35 other states passed new laws encouraging employers to give honest evaluations of workers' job performance. Many of the laws, passed in 2004 and 2005, strengthened disclosure requirements for healthcare facilities. This story has left you feeling uneasy, with your heart racing and chills down your spine. Then you're in the right place. Here we dive into the depths of terror, exploring the darkest corners of the human mind and the most disturbing mystery. If you have the courage to face these fears and want to discover more macabre stories, join us. Subscribe now and become part of our community, where terror is real and the stories will haunt you long after the screen goes dark. Don't miss a chapter of this dark journey. We're just getting started.